The New York Rangers and New Jersey Devils score big wins outdoors at the NHL Stadium Series. We will discuss both games and the event itself. Plus, the Vancouver Canucks remain near the top of the NHL standings, but what will it take for them to finish there? All that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
Your Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. We just had one of the more exciting Stadium Series games in recent memory, and John Chik of Locked On New York Rangers is here to talk about that. John, your first reaction to that dramatic comeback and the overtime win for the Rangers?
Well, Gus, or Gil, excuse me, I mentioned this to you just a second ago, but I said to you that I think we're going to have to do a two-part episode here for Locked On New York Rangers, and I kind of stand by that because this was absolutely wild. Kind of as you mentioned before we hit record there, basically it was almost like three different games in one, and my head's still kind of spinning. I mean, as we're recording this, it ended maybe like 15 minutes ago or whatever it was, but I mean, Artemi Panarin in the overtime strengthening his case for, possible MVP consideration. I don't know if he's going to win it, but I mean, his importance to this Ranger team cannot possibly be understated. So just awesome stuff there. And just absolutely wild. It was not looking good for a long time in this game. Not sure the Rangers, based on how they played for the first, the 60 minutes there, not sure they always deserved to win this one, but I mean, they did rally from a 3-goal hole. They were down by 2 goals with 4 minutes left or whatever it was. So I think you got to take that. And I think even in an imperfect performance, you got to give them some props for coming back the way they did in this one.
Your thoughts on Peter Laviolette's gamble to pull the goalie down by 2 goals on a power play with about 4.5 minutes left in the game, and it paid off. He pulled the goalie both times, scored both times on the power play.
Yeah, you don't see that every day. There's times where I do think NHL coaches at times can be like a little too trigger happy when it comes to pulling the goalie. I don't like seeing, my team, say like they're down by a goal and there's like 2:30 to go. I don't want to see the goalie pulled because if you give up an empty net goal and there's like still 2:15 to go, it's like, man, we had all this time left to get the equalizer. But in the case of this game, down by 2 goals and going up in the power play, I think it made sense, even though there were like 5 minutes left at that point or however much time was left, because you got to make it happen. If you're down by 1 goal, you can't do that. But down by 2, obviously, you got to force the issue a little bit. So that worked. And then a little bit later, believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, without looking at my notes, that they got back on the power play and once again pulled the goalie. And it once again worked. And, kind of the same deal there. I mean, at that point, you've already scored a goal with the goalie pulled. Maybe kind of go back to the well and try it again. And obviously by that point, time was starting to dwindle a little bit. So yeah, obviously, it worked out and it's just great to see the Rangers able to capitalize there. And the power play has really been struggling lately. And, hopefully that, the subplot of this whole thing, this big comeback is that maybe they're getting that unit back to where it needs to be as well. Cause they were like 1 for 22 before they put in a few today.
Always helps to face the 32nd best penalty kill in the NHL. But hopefully from a Ranger standpoint, they can get some momentum from that. Your thoughts on the overall experience, the weekend in New Jersey, the way the NHL handled this game and just the pageantry of it all?
Yeah, overall, I thought it was good. I mean, these outdoor games are always a lot of fun. It just kind of breaks up the monotony, I guess you could say, of the 82-game season. I mean, I love hockey. I'll watch no matter what arena or what stadium they're in or indoors, outdoors, however they want to play the game. But it's always cool watching these games. And my only complaint, I think, is that camera that ESPN uses that kind of like sways back and forth and makes you feel like you're getting like the kind of nauseousness you would get on a plane. I could do without that. But other than that, man, I thought everything was cool. The post-game handshakes I thought were a nice touch. And yeah, I mean, it's a special event every year, and they do these handful of outdoor games. And Rangers now 5-0. So I don't know, maybe they need more outdoor games on the schedule going forward. We'll see how they do it.
Before this game started, obviously Blake Wheeler lost for the season, probably for the New York Rangers, although we don't have an official estimate of how long he's going to be out. But how does this affect the Rangers, and how do they respond to it, both personnel-wise and emotionally?
Yeah, emotionally, I mean, you can tell, Blake Wheeler obviously hasn't been there long, just signed with them this offseason, but Chris Kreider was like choked up trying to talk about it, and like kind of kept his answers short because I don't think he wanted to go into too much detail. Jacob Trouba, him and Blake Wheeler close from their days in Winnipeg. Trouba, it was tough on him, I think. Laviolette said the same thing. You can tell very well-liked, very well-respected player in that locker room. And just unfortunate, man. It's just one of those things that can happen. It wasn't even like a vicious hit or a dirty hit or anything like that, but, his skate just kind of got caught underneath him and bent the way that it's not supposed to. And next thing you know, it's a pretty gruesome injury and out for the year probably. They've left the door ever so slightly cracked as far as maybe that he could return a little bit later. Like if the Rangers make a deep postseason run, it's possible he could get back in there. But, whether that happens or not, obviously I think this means that right wing, which I think has mostly been the Rangers' biggest need all season, is just that much more so. It also means, there's been some chatter of maybe the Rangers could field offers for Capo Caco. I think now that you're down a right winger, a position where you're already thin, I don't think there's any way that they're going to even consider moving Capo Caco, especially with him starting to play a little bit better recently as well. So, I mean, that's kind of where things stand. It was kind of a toss-up for me between center and right wing as far as the Rangers' biggest need at the deadline. But with Johnny Brodzinski kind of emerging a little bit as the third-line center, you combine that with Blake Wheeler's not going to be available anymore. Yeah, to me, that the scales have tipped back toward right wing. And I'll be very surprised if the Rangers don't add at least one right winger between now and the deadline.
So you mentioned a right wing. How do you expect the Rangers to handle this upcoming trade deadline? What are they willing to give up? How much cap room do they have? And who are some of the targets you expect them to go after?
Yeah, they have a little bit more cap room now because obviously, Philip Hedl dealing with the recurring concussions, and he's now on LTIR. And off the top of my head, I want to say his cap hit is around like $4.2 million. It's somewhere in that ballpark. So that gives the Rangers a little bit more flexibility there as far as like players that they could look to acquire. I mean, a name that I feel like it's happened in the past, but Jordan Eberle's name comes up every now and then. That's a possibility. I think a guy that Ranger fans would love to see is Frank Vetrano. Although, this time around, they traded for him a couple of years ago. All they had to give up was a 4th-round pick, and they're going to have to give up quite a bit more if they want him back. Maybe a reunion with Vladimir Tarasenko could even make some sense. But I'm kind of hoping that, you hope that they do something, but, who's this year's Frank Vetrano? Who's that guy that's on a team right now that, maybe doesn't have a big role, or maybe he doesn't fit the system, or something just not quite clicking where, Drury can go out and find that player and give away next to nothing to get him. And then he comes in and maybe isn't a superstar, but, a steady contributing member of this team. That's kind of what I've been trying to figure out on my show. And I've done a couple of deep dives, but still kind of looking. And I'm sure the Rangers themselves are still doing their due diligence and, trying to find the right players to bring in at the deadline. But I think it has to be a right winger for sure. You got to get at least one right winger.
And who's expendable at this point, or are they going to look more to give up draft picks and prospects?
I think it would be draft picks. If you look at kind of Chris Drury's history, he seems to favor trading away draft picks more so than prospects. The Rangers have some really good prospects, but I can't imagine for a second that they would trade Gabe Perreault, who they just drafted and is just setting college hockey on fire right now. Brent Othman is a 1st-round pick from a few years ago. He just puts up video game numbers at like every level that he plays at. He was actually up with the Rangers for 3 games earlier this season. Maybe he even becomes an option to be called back up. We'll see. But yeah, maybe like some mid-level prospects or draft picks. Again, he seems more willing to part with draft picks than prospects. And I'm not even sure if the Ranger 1st-round draft pick is available this year, because there was that whole story, and I'm not sure if it's even true or not, but it was suggested that Dolan might not want to trade the 1st-round pick because the draft is in the Sphere next year, which he owns, and he wants the Rangers to be a part of that, which is the most ridiculous reason for not doing something of like anything ever. But again, I don't know if that's true or not. Another reporter came out and refuted that claim. So we'll see, man. But I think if something significant is going to be on the move, the Rangers give something up, I think it'll be draft picks as opposed to prospects or certainly anybody on the current roster.
John, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, so you can find this podcast. It's on every audio platform that you can name. Wherever you're listening to this or watching this, you can find Locked On Rangers there as well. You can find me on Twitter at jchik17, and then you've got the Twitter handle of the podcast itself at LO_NY_Rangers. So yeah, definitely give me a follow, say hi. Always love talking Ranger hockey.
John, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Gil. Really appreciate it.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at Camino Consulting. How would you like to get to know somebody better in an hour than you would in a year? Understanding one another better prevents small misunderstandings from becoming big, ongoing fights. Well, after providing more than 20 years in mid-sized businesses, helping management groups navigate conflict and onboarding new employees, Camino is now offering a digital seminar for families and couples. Did your Valentine's gift of tickets to the game not go over as well as you hoped? Get the couples and family online seminar for 25% off for the month of February using the discount code Locked On. Again, that is discount code Locked On for 25% off for the rest of the month at www.caminoconsulting.ca, or mention Locked On when reaching out for a business seminar and receive the first 5 profiles free. Again, that's www.caminoconsulting.ca. Check it out today. It is always great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On New Jersey Devils, Trey Matthews. And Trey, quite a weekend for the Devils, a big 6-3 win over the Philadelphia Flyers. What stood out most about this important win for the Devils on Saturday?
Well, the thing is like, Mark Cuban had this saying, which is people aren't going to really remember the game in general because the Devils did come away with a 6-3 victory over the Flyers, but they're going to remember the experience. And I said it on my recent episode that this Stadium Series felt like a Super Bowl for the Devils because they performed in front of 70,000 plus people. People were tailgating. You got live performances from Gaslight Anthem, the Jonas Brothers. The overall experience was just top notch for this type of feel. I spoke with Catherine Bogart, the team reporter for the Devils, about the matter, and she also gave her insight as to what fans could expect. So in the long run, this was a very successful event for the Devils. And to add on to that, it was their reunion of sorts at the Meadowlands. Yes, they weren't playing in their same barn in which they won 3 Stanley Cups in, but they were still in that same vicinity. And Martin Brodeur said, like, he just got so much nostalgia by just pulling up to the parking lot and just reminiscing over the good times where the team would do their championship parade, their celebrations. I know Matt Loughlin, the play-by-play announcer for a Devils radio feed, he was feeling some sort of way of nostalgia. So just in general, this event was top-notch for the Devils.
And what did it mean to New Jersey and that area to be hosting this game?
It meant a lot because they're at their old stomping grounds, and this was probably one of their biggest games of the season. And they came out guns blazing thanks to Nico Hischier leading the way and scoring the opening goal 30 seconds in. And whether you were watching on TV, whether you were there in person, I think everyone can attest and say that that was probably one of the best games of the season, a season in which has been very up and down for the Devils, very inconsistent, plagued with injuries. This was a good bright spot, and the Devils have now collected 7 points in their last 5 games, and they also snapped the Flyers' 5-game point streak. So it was just the cherry on top for what was at stake for the Devils, and they're starting to gain some traction in both the Metropolitan Division and the wild card standings.
How important was it for this team to rise to the occasion and also to beat a division rival?
You know, I look back to a tweet that Amanda Stein, the other team reporter for the Devils, said, basically Amanda broke the news and said that Gaslight Anthem would perform live after every Devils goal because their song Howl is played after every Devils goal at the Prudential Center. And someone asked her, like, what if the Devils get shut out? Then what? And Amanda Stein responded by saying, not an option. And the Devils scored a touchdown on the Flyers, whereas the Flyers, they converted on a field goal.
Injuries obviously have been a part of this season. You alluded to that. Give me some updates on some of the players who are still out, because obviously getting some of them back would be critical to the Devils down the stretch.
So I think the biggest injury update was Jack Hughes returning to action. He's been playing in the last few games, and he's currently on a 4-game point streak. He has 5 points during that 4-game stretch, and he, in the previous matchup against the Flyers, he has now reached the 50-point mark in 38 games. So the big question for Jack Hughes early on in his career, what could his numbers be if he just stayed healthy? Because I think he'd be one of the finalists for the Hart Trophy if he didn't miss significant time. And then Brendan Smith, he returned to action a few games ago, albeit Santeri Hatakka had to be sent back down to Utica. He was performing really well on the Devils blue line, but we'll see him back in a Devils sweater sooner rather than later. And for the bigger injuries, Jonas Siegenthaler is still out. Dougie Hamilton, Tom Fitzgerald told the media that he is still a ways away. We're hoping that he can come back for the playoffs, but that's down the road, and the Devils have to get to the playoffs for that to be a possibility.
One thing that may help them get to the playoffs, the recent solid goaltending by Nico Dawes. Talk to me about what he's meant to this team recently and whether or not you feel he is the solution to the team's struggles in goal this year.
There's a new king atop of the NHL history books for most saves in an outdoor matchup, and it belongs to Nico Dawes. He has played in his 4th game in the past six days, and he has been really good in that for the Devils. And who would have thought that he would have been the answer? Because last year he had hip surgery. He had to be shut down early in Utica, and now he has come back, and he's sort of the saving grace for the Devils, and you can't ignore that. So he's been making save after save after save and just being very vital for the Devils. And it now raises the debate, which is, what do the Devils need? Do they need goaltending, or do they need defense? Well, I think Nico Dawes sort of fixes that issue. Obviously, who's going to back him up? Is it going to be Vitek Vanacek? Is it going to be Akira Schmid? Right now, Vanacek is out with a lower body injury. He should be back sooner rather than later. But the thing is like Nico Dawes, he's really helped the Devils in net, and maybe he could be the answer. But you don't want to put too much pressure on his shoulders because he did have hip surgery last year, and I don't want that kind of scrutiny on him, because the Devils have had a history of overworking their promising goalies in Corey Schneider, Mackenzie Blackwood, and that didn't really pan out too well. So Schneider, good start to his Devils tenure, crashed and burned. Mackenzie Blackwood never reached his full potential because he dealt with injury. Now, I don't want the same fate to happen to Nico Dawes, so I just advise the Devils to be somewhat cautious when using him. But I can't deny it, he's been really good. And when looking at the trade market, I think it's going to come down to what's easier for Tom Fitzgerald to obtain. Is it going to be a goaltender? Is it going to be a defenseman? I spoke to Chico Resch about it, and you should be very familiar with Mr. Resch because he got you guys your first Stanley Cup back in, 1980? So the thing is like, he said, like, is it the goaltending? Is it defense? Chico told me it's mostly the defense, but how can you give Luke Hughes and Shimon Nemets 5 years plus experience? You can't, because they have a lot of responsibilities on their shoulder, and the Devils have lost a lot of depth assets on the blue line, including Jonas Siegenthaler, including Dougie Hamilton. So it's been a bit of a struggle in that sort of regards. But I think they're going to try to trade for some more physicality, more grit, and a depth asset, because I think the asking price for a goalie is going to be a little too much for them to handle. So I talked about UC Soros, talked about John Gibson, talked about Jacob Markstrom. But the thing is, the Devils will have to play to the opponent's game, because it's just like the ball is in their courts, because the goalie market is so spread thin. So it's not going to be easy.
What do you think the Devils are willing to part with to bring in either that defenseman or that goalie?
At this point, I think the only roster piece that might be dealt away and people might have mixed emotions about it is Alexander Holtz. Personally, I'm willing to part ways with him, but it has to be for the right price. I don't want it to be a 1-year rental because Alexander Holtz is in his early 20s. He could give you 10 plus years of good service. He just hasn't been given the role that I think he deserves. I think he deserves more time on the ice. And I just want to make something perfectly clear. Where you're at on the lines, it does not equal ice time. I think he deserves a few extra minutes and to showcase his skill set. I'm willing to part ways with them, but for the right price. And I think that's what Devils fans are willing to do as well. And when it comes to prospects, I think people are very high on Lenny Haminaho and Seamus Casey. I don't think you should trade those prospects. So I think it comes down to like maybe Alexander Holtz or maybe a prospect that maybe won't be given a chance to showcase their skill set on the Devils roster. It's going to be a little tough, but I think Tom Fitzgerald will try to work something out. And also, like where the Devils are at in the standings, if they completely just fall out the playoff race and Tyler Toffoli says he doesn't want to re-sign with the Devils, then that's a very valuable asset that the Devils have to move at the trade deadline, because I'm sure Tyler Toffoli can get you some decent assets for a team that is trying to contend for a Stanley Cup.
No question about that. We'll keep an eye on that, and I know you'll be on top of it. Trey, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
You can find Locked On Devils wherever you get your podcast from, including YouTube, and you can follow me on X at TreyMatt4 or the show's X page app at Locked On Devils. And the season is not over. Devils still have a chance, and I think what they've been doing the last few string of games has been very hopeful for a lot of people. 7 points in the last 5 outings.
All right, Trey, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. We're past the halfway point in the season, hockey fans. But regardless of where your favorite team is in the current standings, I want to remind you, you could win big playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our #1 choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether studs like McDavid, Crosby, or McKinnon will record more or less than their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus, minus, and more in a given game. To win a 100 times bet on Sleeper, you need to correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. You heard me, hockey fans. You can win 100 times your money playing daily fantasy hockey with Sleeper. So use promo code LOCKEDONNHL. You'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Canucks. He's loose. He's ready. Trevor Beggs. And Trevor, good time to be a Canucks fan. The gritty loss to Winnipeg notwithstanding. Talk to me about what has made this team so good this year that they're, still at or near the top of the NHL standings.
You know what, Gil? They seem to be getting better. And I think, obviously a big reason for this turnaround is Rick Tocchet, the structure he's implemented. But, even that bottom half of the lineup is really stepping up now, both in the forward group and on defense. I mean, I actually wonder if this is a story around the NHL, but the Canucks have, I would say the best third line in the NHL without question, right? We did an episode kind of going through other grid third lines, but what that line of Dakota Joshua, Teddy Blueger, and Connor Garland has done, 3 misfits coming together. They each have 20 even strength points in the last 31 games, I believe it is. Like, it's actually unreal what that line is doing. Like, those numbers rank up there. I think they're all in the top 50 among NHL skaters. So it's almost disrespectful to call them a third line. They've been unbelievable. They've been so much more than that. And then on defense as well, you look at guys like Noah Juleson. People had probably never heard of this guy, or they might have known him as the first-round pick from the Habs. He came into Vancouver this season and looked terrible, but Adam Foote, the coaching staff, has worked with this guy. He was rewarded with his first goal of the season on Saturday against Winnipeg. Tyler Myers as well. The guy was an absolute disaster for 4 years in Vancouver. He looks respectable. And you look at the underlying numbers, and it's, the Canucks, even sometimes when they're not scoring, are playing well defensively. And, before, I think it was a bit of a pop gun offense. It still is to a certain extent, but they're really cleaning things up on the defensive side of the puck as well. Now, I'll say the one caveat, and they got caught with this in Winnipeg, as the games start to feel more playoff-like, one of the reasons the Canucks lost the Winnipeg Jets over the weekend was I think they got caught chasing the physical game against a team who plays physical. So I think that was a good a learning lesson for the Canucks because, hey, there's going to be a lot of games that feel like the playoffs down the stretch here.
How do you fix that? I mean, you talk about a learning experience, but what do the Canucks have to do differently the next time they're faced with a very physical opponent?
Yeah, I think the Canucks have to, toe the line between obviously being physical, but not just chasing hits, right? I know I mentioned Noah Juleson, and I felt bad for the guy because after the Winnipeg loss, he was blaming himself for it. And, he has a point on that game-winning goal, right? He goes and chases the hit. He absolutely belts Mark Scheifele, but the Jets go in, Kyle Connor and Gabe Vilardi go in 2-on-1 and score a pretty easy goal, right? So I think the Canucks got to stick to their bread and butter. They got to be physical, but they also got to be a team that just continues to forecheck down low, continues to protect the middle of the ice. So I think they just got to keep playing their game. Mind you, a big test will be starting to play some good teams down the stretch, right? The Canucks, that was their first game against Winnipeg. They still play the Winnipeg Jets 2 more times. They play Colorado 2 more times, I believe. They play the Golden Knights 3 more times. The Oilers once. The rematch against Boston, who spanked them about a week ago, is coming up next Saturday, or this upcoming Saturday, I should say. So, yeah, there's some really good tests coming down the stretch. I talked about a couple weeks ago, the Canucks had the hardest schedule in the Western Conference remaining in the NHL about a week ago. I don't think much has changed there. So they're going to get some stiff tests down the stretch. I think that's going to make them ready for the playoffs, or at least going to test to see if they are ready for the playoffs.
What's your biggest concern about this team as we head into the last couple of months of the season?
One of the biggest concerns right now is the top 6, ironically enough, right? Which to me isn't as big as a concern as everyone's making it out to be. But, in fairness, you look at the Jets game on Saturday, it's the Jets top players scoring and the Canucks stars being shut out. There's been a lot of nights recently where that bottom 6, as I mentioned, has been the one that stepped up, whereas that top 6 has gone kind of quiet. So I think it's a matter of kind of finding that chemistry in the top 6. Pettersson's had a revolving door of line mates all season long. I do like the trio up there with Lindholm and Höglander. They had a really good game against the Detroit Red Wings last week on Thursday. But I think the Canucks, every good team goes through a bit of a slow stretch. And the Canucks, again, knock on wood, haven't really gone through theirs yet, right? The Jets have had a slow stretch. The Avs have had a slow stretch. The Knights have had a slow stretch. So I think for the Canucks, probably the biggest thing that concerns me is I still don't necessarily believe that this defense is for real, if I'm being honest with you. I really like what Hughes and Hronek brought, but the rest of the defense has definitely played above the sum of their parts. Are they going to be able to keep that up down the stretch? I certainly hope so. Certainly, when you watch the Canucks play, the eye test is telling you that, yeah, this defense is better. And again, guys like Juleson and Myers are stepping up, but there's been a lot of scar tissue in this market. We've seen a lot of Tyler Myers mistakes. Nikita Zadorov has come in and he's been fun, but he's made mistakes too. I just wonder, against the best teams like the Jets, the Avs, the Knights, is this Canucks defense going to hold up in the playoffs? I still think that's a pretty legitimate question.
So if you're the general manager of the Vancouver Canucks, what do you look to do at the trade deadline? And do you think the team will do a similar thing that you think they should do?
2 words, Chris Tanev. No, I'm just kidding, but I'm not. I'm only half kidding. I mean, honestly, I still think another right shot defenseman would be a prudent add for this organization. I know they've liked, Myers and his resurgence, and Juleson's played well. And then you have Hronek as your number 1 right shot D. But I would probably add another defenseman to the mix. It depends what the cost is going to be. The thing right now with the Canucks is, I think one of the reasons they're rumored to be after Phil Kessel is because they just don't have much cap space left, right? Like pretty much every other team around the NHL. So if you're going to make a sizable add, you're either going to need the team to, retain a lot of cap space, which, results in giving them more assets, or you're going to have to move someone out. And that's why on the show this week we talked about the potential of moving out Ilya Mikheyev, who's kind of filled in for Dakota Joshua, who's missed the last games with injury. And part of the argument was, again, you got to subtract from this team in order to, if you do want to make a big add, like a top 4 defenseman or another top 6 winger, it still feels that the Canucks could use another top 6 winger. Höglander's been on the 4th line all year, has deserved better, is now on the top line. But then you have Pius Suter, who's played well, but he's your second line left winger alongside Miller and Besser. It still feels like you could use another top 6 winger and another top 4 defenseman. I think they're only going to get one of those pieces, maybe, or it might just be depth adds. But, we've seen how aggressive that Rutherford and Alvin have been, not just with the Canucks, but throughout their history together, in particular Rutherford. So another big move wouldn't necessarily shock me. But, if you go chase a Jake Gensel per se, like you're giving up the Lekaramaki, like the top prospect in this organization. So no easy answers there. I would lean towards adding a defenseman personally. Will they do it? I'm not quite sure. I'm going to call it a coin flip.
Okay, well, should be interesting to say the least. And what in your mind is the key to a strong finish for this team?
Yeah, I think they got to show up against the best teams, right? And, to the Canucks' credit, they've done a good job. But there's a stat out there this week that they have the third best record against winning teams. So it's not like they've been pushed over by winning teams. I mean, they beat the Carolina Hurricanes twice. They beat the Panthers twice. They obviously smoked the Oilers 3 times, although that was a different version of the Oilers than the one that's playing right now. But they got a lot of tough games coming up down the stretch. And I think it's just a matter of, not just showing up and playing hard in those games like they did against Winnipeg, but winning those games, right? Giving this team the confidence that they can go into the playoffs, knowing that they can beat any team in the NHL, which they should have that confidence now. But, you go lose a bunch of games to Colorado and Vegas, that might feel a little differently come playoff time. So I think it's showing up and beating a number of good opponents up on their schedule would be the number one thing for this team.
All right, Trevor, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
All right, you can find me on social media at Trev Beggs. My co-host Kyle Bowen, Bhawan. You can find him on Instagram and TikTok, I believe. And of course, you can find our podcast Locked On Canucks on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to podcasts. Hey, been a fun ride. We joined March 1st of last year. We're up to about 1,500 subscribers now from a couple hundred when we started. It's been a ton of fun, and it certainly helps that the team's winning some hockey games and is the best team in the NHL. Let's go.
Never hurts, right? All right, Trevor, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Gil.
Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. I want to thank my guests, John Chik of Locked On New York Rangers, Trey Matthews of Locked On New Jersey Devils, and Trevor Beggs of Locked On Canucks for joining me today. I am Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. I want to thank everyone for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget, we are here every day, Monday through Friday, bringing you the biggest stories from around the National Hockey League. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.